Let's talk to the Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Annabel Denham. Good evening, Annabel.
Good evening, Kevin.
Yes, this is no laughing matter. The NHS, I think, is in much deeper problems than people are willing to admit. We have a 5.3 million strong waiting list. I mean, literally, people with cataracts, for example, a relatively minor operation to cure, are going blind before they get surgery. People are waiting for surgery for over 2 years. Some people are waiting for even basic treatment for years. It is not fit for purpose at the moment, and it's not just the COVID crisis. The supporters of the NHS, those who call it our amazing NHS and irrationally worship it, which is another issue we have to discuss about, our attitudes to the NHS makes no sense at all. They say, oh, it's because of a lack of money. Last year they got £212 billion. £212 billion. I don't think the problem in the end is money. I think it's disorganisation, it's inefficiency. It is thousands of overpaid middle managers making poor decisions. What's your feeling about the NHS?
I couldn't agree with you more, Kevin. You're absolutely right. The NHS isn't fit for purpose. It hasn't been for some time. And now we are starting to hear about the backlogs. We're hearing about the waiting times that are the longest they've ever been on record. And it's very easy to look at this data and in an almost cold way, see it as numbers on a piece of paper. But of course, we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about minor procedures, as you say, that they are not getting that can lead to longer term, much more serious health issues. We're talking about the UK having, poorer cancer outcomes than most countries in Western Europe. If the UK's breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, bowel cancer patients, if they were treated in the Netherlands rather than on the NHS, then more than 9,000 lives would be saved every year. That's just one example. We have worse healthcare outcomes for respiratory illnesses, for heart attacks than many countries in Western Europe. In fact, we're more on par with the Czech Republic and Slovenia than we are with, our comparable countries in terms of GDP in Europe. And there was an interesting piece in the Sunday Times from a doctor called Rachel Clark. She works in palliative care. She's absolutely on the coalface, and she has really brought to light how the NHS cannot continue in its current form. And it's almost encouraging for classical liberals such as myself to hear these sorts of stories, to read these sorts of articles, because it gives us a modicum of hope that we might at last be able to have an honest and open discussion about the reforms, the root and branch reforms that the NHS needs.
Yeah, I read Rachel Clark's piece in the Sunday Times, and it was, it was quite dramatic stuff. She did sort of conclude, she said something like, you get the NHS you pay for, which is feeding into this idea we don't give the NHS enough money. I think that we do. I think the problem with the NHS is disorganisation and inefficiency. As I said earlier, there are thousands of middle managers making poor decisions. For example, why did the NHS allow itself to turn into the COVID-only service, the fixation with COVID at the expense of so many other serious conditions, particularly cancer? And to be honest with you, it should not have allowed itself to become pingdemic central. I mean, it should have pointed out at an early stage to the government, look, of course we're going to get pinged. We're close to patients with COVID. Why did it allow itself to fall into this state? I think this is the problem. They take a lot of money and they do not spend it wisely.
I share your skepticism, Kevin, absolutely. Like you say, this opinion piece that came out on Sunday, it was in the Sunday Times, from this top doctor, brought it back to this point that we get the healthcare service that we pay for. But the UK has been spending more on healthcare than the OECD and EU averages for several years now. In 2019, healthcare spending exceeded 10% of GDP for the first time, and it's undoubtedly risen since. And yet we have fewer doctors per 1,000 people than the OECD average. We have fewer hospital beds per 1,000 people than the OECD average. We have poorer outcomes, as we've discussed. So something isn't matching up here. And the trouble that we have is that even if the funding constraints are real. In a fully tax-funded system, healthcare spending decisions will always be political decisions. The NHS's budget is always going to be whatever the government of the day decides it should be. And sometimes we might agree with the government spending priorities and sometimes we might not. But this is a feature of the system, not a bug. And if you're advocating for a system which vests politicians with so much power, then you can't be consistently and constantly outraged when those politicians do not use that power in the way that you want them to.
One of the problems I think we have with our health service is our strange attitude to it. Of course, we all admire doctors and nurses who worked hard and bravely through the COVID crisis, but they've been elevated to almost sort of saintly status, absolutely hero worship by a public that went out and applauded them and applauded the NHS. I mean, I suppose at a stretch, I'll applaud these people for going to work and doing the job they're paid for, which is basically what it amounted to. But I don't see why we ever applauded the organisation of the NHS, which we worship with an irrational devotion. It's not a particularly good health service. And one of the things we have to do, tell me if you agree, is we have to somehow recalibrate our national attitude to this underperforming, flawed service.
Well, if the NHS was the closest thing that we had to a national religion going into the crisis, then Lord knows what we call it now. You're absolutely right, Kevin. We had the former Healthcare Secretary, Matt Hancock, saying that the NHS was the best gift a nation had ever given itself. Out we went onto our doorsteps, banging pots and cheering for essentially a state institution as though we were in North Korea. Of course, as you say, this isn't to downplay the heroic efforts of doctors and nurses on the front line during the pandemic, but unfortunately they are trapped within a failed system. A lot of the issues and the pressures and the dangers that they faced over the course of the pandemic were because the NHS simply isn't fit for purpose. And I'm concerned that the pandemic has just made it more difficult for us to talk about the reforms that the NHS needs, for any politician to dare to stick their neck above the parapet and start to try and trigger an honest conversation. I simply cannot see it happening. What we have really in the UK with the NHS is the equivalent of what the French have with Bastille Day. It's sort of a national romance. But the problem that we have in the UK is that unlike Bastille Day, it has real world consequences. And as I say, I struggle to see how after the pandemic we're really going to have the reforms that we need. And the problem is that any time that you try to talk about the NHS, your advocates of this system, its ardent supporters, will erect these two rhetorical straw men. They'll tell you that you're criticising those frontline workers when patently that isn't true. If you were criticising our education system, nobody would accuse you of attacking teachers. And the second is that they suggest that you want the US healthcare system. Well, very few people would advocate for a system like you have in the US, where people face medical bankruptcy. What we're actually often suggesting is that we move to a social healthcare insurance system like you get in some countries on the continent, such as Germany and the Netherlands, which have better healthcare outcomes than we do in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, people go, oh, my God, we mustn't have an American system. Well, we've pretty much got that right now because unless you're an A&E case, a 999 case, you just won't get treatment. And that's the same in America. If you're a 911 case, as they call it over there, you will get treatment, but you just won't get long-term surgery or anything like that. So we've pretty much got an American system. And what we have to divest ourselves of, I think, in a major way, is to stop chanting protect the NHS and remember that it's not our job to protect the NHS, it is the NHS's job to protect us.
I couldn't agree more. And isn't it interesting how that's changed over the course of the coronavirus pandemic? And what I worry about is that we're on a slippery slope now. It's don't leave your homes to protect the NHS, wear a face mask to protect the NHS, socially distance to protect the NHS. Well, what happens when we come into flu season? Are we going to have to adapt our behaviours again to protect the NHS? What about what we eat or drink, or how we drive our cars, or whether we smoke, or whether, all of these lifestyle decisions that that we make, the trade-offs that we make. We perhaps take on a bit of risk, but it gives us pleasure. Are we going to be told that we can no longer engage in these activities because it might one day at some point in the future increase pressure on the NHS? It's all topsy-turvy, and we really need to, as you said, recalibrate that relationship.
Yes, otherwise we're never going to be able to address the enormous problems with our health service sensibly. As you rightly alluded to earlier, politicians are absolutely petrified of discussing the NHS unless they adore it. So that we do not get anything sensible from our body politic about our health service. Let's try and finish on a positive note or an optimistic note if we can. Clearly something needs to be done, and something needs to be done urgently. What do you think it is? My personal feeling, Annabel, is we should stop looking across the channel at France and Germany and saying, oh, well, you see, their service, it's partly privatised, and we can't have partly privatised, and not everybody gets treated the same. Some people have to pay for it. Well, instead of that attitude and, sort of absolutely adoring the kind of free at the point of service system that we have right now, surely we've got to start looking at the French and the Germans and the other systems that work really well and say, let's stop knocking them and let's start copying them.
Well, the issue that you face as an advocate of NHS reform is that, well, two things. I think most people don't perhaps appreciate that other countries don't have a healthcare system like the NHS, and that we're actually unique in having this state-run monopoly. And I also think that people aren't aware of how healthcare outcomes differ in the UK, even though there's this wealth of data, and people like you and me, Kevin, try and push that into the public domain, but it just isn't absorbed. It's not being digested by people on a large scale. So it makes it very, very difficult to make the case for reform. Advocates of the NHS have been very clever, really. And my feeling is that all we can really try and do is hold the line. We can't give up on NHS reform. It might not be a fight that we can win, but if we don't engage in self-defense, then we're going to lose even more ground than we are currently. So I think we've just got to keep fighting the good fight and hope that at some point that data, which is really, on the side of enacting root and branch reform, starts to resonate with people on a large scale.
Yeah, I kind of refuse to believe that £212 billion in a year isn't sufficient for almost anything, especially running a health service. But the way they use that money is incredibly dubious. So one way we could start to improve the NHS surely would be to reform it in terms of the amount of money it spends on its staff, particularly all these six-figure salaried middle managers who, as I say, frankly seem to get paid astronomical sums of money to make bad decisions. We need to get rid of a lot of them, don't we? And spend the money on medical services and doctors and nurses.
Well, I think there's the absence of accountability. That's the problem with having this huge state-run institution that employs 1.5 million people, is that no one quite knows where the waste is. And because there isn't that accountability, there isn't that responsibility, it's very difficult to, to bring about... That's
the NHS. They want a word with you.
Yeah, 111. No, so it's very difficult to, bring about the changes that are required. And what's interesting, at the moment is, and it's not just the NHS, it's the police as well. They're kicking up a stink about the fact that they're having a pay freeze. NHS workers, some are considering going on strike because they're not because they're only getting a 3% pay rise. And there seems to be this sort of idea at the moment that the pandemic hasn't happened, that we're not 372 billion pounds in the hole, and that's the COVID price tag that we're going to have to pay back at some point, saddling future generations with huge amounts of debt. And the message should be pretty clear that when the wealth creating side of the economy starts to shrink, then you need to pare back the public sector. But things seem to be moving in the opposite direction, and as you say, we're kind of seeing that with these ever increasing salaries among some middle managers in the NHS.
Absolutely. We've got to stop worshipping it, otherwise we will never be able to deal with this problem rationally. I think that phone that you might be just been pinged there, Annabel, so we'll see you in 10 days, okay?
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Annabel.